The morning Ezekiel Wilcox rode into Dusty Creek, Texas. He was not in the business of being surprised by anything, and yet the town managed to do exactly that within the first 3 minutes of his arrival, because nothing about what he saw matched what he had been told, and the gap between those two things would change the entire course of his life. It was the spring of 1882, and the Texas Panhandle had been baking under an early heat that cracked the earth into puzzle pieces and turned the creek beds into memories. Dusty Creek was not a large town, not by any measure a man who had traveled the length of Texas, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado might use. It had a general store with a sagging porch, a livery stable that smelled of hay and something older and ranker underneath, a saloon called the Rusty Spur that advertised cold beer on a sign, so weathered the letters were barely visible, and a scattering of homes and buildings that looked as though the wind had nudged them into position sometime in the last decade, and they had never quite decided whether to stay. Ezekiel Wilcox was 31 years old, broad through the shoulder, lean through everything else, with dark hair that curled at his collar when it got too long, which it currently was. He had the kind of face that was not precisely handsome in a soft way, but carried a certain rough geography to it that most people found either trustworthy or dangerous, depending on what they needed from him at the time. His eyes were a grayish-green, the color of sage after rain, and they moved constantly, cataloging, assessing, filing information away with the efficiency of a man who had learned the hard way that missing a detail could cost you everything. He had a reputation, but not the kind that came with a wanted poster. Ezekiel Wilcox was known in certain circles as a man who settled debts, not with violence, not primarily, though he was capable of that when circumstance demanded. He was the man you hired when someone owed you money and had decided geography was a workable substitute for repayment. He found people. He talked to them. He came home with what was owed, or a very good reason why he could not, and in 11 years of doing this work across the Western Territories, he had almost never come home empty-handed. The debt that had brought him to Dusty Creek belonged to a man named Harold Wainwright, or at least it had belonged to Harold Wainwright. Ezekiel's employer, a cattle broker named Silas Beaumont who operated out of Amarillo, had explained the situation with the particular kind of sputtering indignation that rich men reserved for occasions when someone else's bad behavior inconvenienced them personally. Harold Wainwright had been a rancher with 40 acres, a modest herd, and an appetite for cards that exceeded his skill at them considerably. Over the course of 3 months in the winter of 1881, he had lost at Beaumont's private card tables a sum that Ezekiel found impressive in its recklessness. The debt had been called in. Harold Wainwright had promised to pay. And then Harold Wainwright had done something that no amount of promises could undo, because Harold Wainwright had gone and died in January of 1882, thrown from a horse during an ice storm and found frozen the following morning by one of his ranch hands. Death, as a rule, did not erase debts in Silas Beaumont's personal accounting system. What it did was transfer them. Harold had a daughter who had inherited the 40 acres and the modest herd, and apparently the debt along with everything else. Beaumont had written to her twice. She had not responded, and so Beaumont had sent Ezekiel Wilcox to Dusty Creek to conclude the matter in person. The description Beaumont had given of Susan Wainwright was brief, and Ezekiel would soon discover, about as accurate as a map drawn by someone who had never visited the territory. Beaumont had called her a simple ranch girl, probably not much to look at, likely in over her head, the kind of woman who would fold the moment a man of authority appeared and asked her plainly for what was owed. What Ezekiel found when he rode up the track toward the Wainwright place was a woman standing on the roof of the main ranch house with a hammer in one hand and a mouthful of nails, reshingling what appeared to be a significant portion of the structure entirely by herself. She was wearing practical work trousers and a cream-colored shirt rolled to the elbows, her dark auburn hair pinned up in a way that suggested it had started the morning much more neatly and had been winning its argument for freedom ever since. She was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a woman who looked like she was in over her head. She looked, if anything, as though the roof were in over its head. Ezekiel pulled his horse, a patient roan gelding named Cardinal, to a stop at the fence line and looked up at her. She had not acknowledged his arrival. She was working with the focused efficiency of someone who had a specific number of shingles left and intended to finish them before the light changed. "Are you Susan Wainwright?" he called up. She took the nails from her mouth, held them in her palm, and looked down at him with dark brown eyes that were direct in a way that Ezekiel found momentarily off-putting, because directness in a stranger usually meant one of two things, and he had not yet determined which one applied here. "That depends," she said, "on whether you are here to help or to cause difficulty. If you are here to help, then yes, I am Susan Wainwright, and I could use someone to hold the ladder while I come down. If you are here to cause difficulty, I am afraid you have the wrong property." Ezekiel looked at the ladder leaning against the side of the house, then looked back up at her. "What makes you think I might be here to cause difficulty? You are wearing a good coat for a Tuesday in the middle of nowhere," she said. "Men who wear good coats on Tuesdays in the middle of nowhere are generally not coming to fix anything." He almost smiled. He did not quite allow it, because he was there for a professional purpose, and smiling at the person you were about to have a difficult conversation with seemed like the wrong beginning. He dismounted, tied Cardinal to the fence post, and walked to the ladder. He held it. She came down with the ease of someone who had been going up and down that ladder most of the morning, which she probably had. When she reached the ground and turned to face him, she was taller than he had expected, coming to just below his chin, and up close the directness of her gaze was even more apparent. She was 26 years old, he would learn later, and she had the kind of face that was striking rather than conventionally pretty, all strong angles and clear skin with a dusting of freckles across the nose that the Texas sun had put there whether she wanted them or not. "Thank you," she said, brushing sawdust from her shirt. "Now then, which kind are you?" "The second kind," Ezekiel said. "My name is Ezekiel Wilcox. I was sent by Silas Beaumont in Amarillo." Something happened in her face, not fear exactly, more like the expression of a person who has been expecting an unpleasant piece of weather and has just confirmed it on the horizon. She nodded once slowly and said, "I had wondered when he would stop sending letters and start sending someone." "He sent 2 letters," Ezekiel said. "I received them," she said. I did not respond because I did not yet have a response that would satisfy him, and I thought a partial answer was worse than no answer at all. "Would you like to come inside? I have coffee, and I think this is a conversation that deserves to be seated." He had not expected that either. He followed her inside. The interior of the Wainwright house was small and clean with the particular neatness of a person who had too much to do and had made their peace with getting the important things right and letting the decorative things go. The furniture was simple and worn. There was a bookshelf on the east wall with more books on it than Ezekiel would have predicted, ranging from a dog-eared almanac to what looked like a copy of Middlemark. There were curtains on the windows that had been recently mended. The floor had been swept. There were tools on the kitchen table, alongside a ledger book, and a stack of papers that Susan Wainwright moved to one side with the practiced gesture of someone who was always clearing a space for something new. She poured coffee into 2 mismatched cups and set one in front of him and one at her own place, and sat down across from him with her hands folded on the table in a posture that was both composed and braced, and said, "How much does he say I owe?" Ezekiel named the figure. She closed her eyes for just a moment. Then she opened them and said, "My father was an optimist in the worst possible direction. He always believed the next hand would fix whatever the last one had broken." She looked at the ledger on the table. "I cannot pay that figure, not now. The ranch has 40 acres, but 20 of those acres had a drainage problem that my father had been ignoring for 3 years, and I have been spending money correcting it because without correcting it the land is worth nothing. The herd came through the winter short, and I have 12 head to sell in the spring market, but the price is low this year. I have been calculating. She pulled the ledger toward her and turned it so he could see the columns of numbers, which were written in a careful, neat hand. This is what I have. This is what I project to have by fall. This is what I need to keep the ranch operational. And this is the gap between all of that and what Mr. Beaumont believes I owe him. Ezekiel looked at the ledger. He had looked at many ledgers in his career. He could read one, which was not something every man in his line of work could claim. He looked at Susan Wainwright's numbers and he could see 3 things plainly: that she was not lying to him, that she was not hiding anything, and that she was, in fact, managing her father's financial wreckage with a degree of competence that was almost remarkable given the scale of the wreckage. "This isn't your debt," he said. He had not planned to say that. It was not a professional thing to say. "No," she said, with a kind of quiet steadiness. "It is not, but it is my land, and the land is what he will take if someone does not arrange a suitable alternative. So in that sense it very much is my problem. Beaumont's expectation," Ezekiel said carefully, "is that I come back with either the full sum or a deed to the property." "I know," she said. "He made that clear in his second letter." There was a silence between them. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass, and somewhere in the yard a chicken made its feelings known about something. "I am going to be direct with you, Mr. Wilcox," Susan said, "because I find it is usually faster and less painful than not being direct. I have been thinking about this problem for 2 months. I have a plan, but the plan requires time that Mr. Beaumont has not indicated he is willing to give me. I need until November. By November, I can have the spring cattle sold, the fall crop in, and 2 of the south acres leased to my neighbor Mr. Aldridge for his winter grazing, which will bring in enough additional income to cover the debt in full. If Mr. Beaumont gives me until November, he gets every cent. If he takes the land now, he gets a property with a partially repaired drainage problem and 12 head of cattle that aren't worth much until the market improves." Ezekiel looked at her. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the window where the Texas sky was the hard, brilliant blue of a place that took no prisoners. "You are asking me to go back to Beaumont and argue your case," he said. "I am asking you to go back to Beaumont with accurate information," she said. "What you do with it is your business." He looked at the ledger one more time. Then he closed it and pushed it back toward her. "I am going to need to see the land," he said. She blinked. "Why?" "Because if I am going to tell Beaumont anything about what this property is worth and what a November arrangement might produce, I need to have seen it myself. I don't repeat what people tell me. I report what I know." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite warmth, but a kind of recognition, the look of one person identifying in another a quality they had not expected to find there. "All right," she said. "Finish your coffee. I will show you the land." She showed him every inch of it. She walked him from the north pasture, where the grass was beginning to come in after the winter, to the south acres, where the drainage work was visible and impressive. A series of shallow channels cut with precision that redirected water from a low area that had been turning to standing mud and ruining the soil. She showed him the repaired fence line and the newly reinforced barn and the small vegetable garden that fed her through the summer and autumn, a practical woman's practical insurance policy. She showed him the 12 head of cattle which were healthy and well fed, their coats bright in the spring sun. She talked about the land as she walked it, and as she talked Ezekiel listened with a part of himself he did not usually bring to this kind of work. She knew this land. She knew it the way some people know a language they were born into, without thinking, with a fluency that ran deeper than learned information. She knew which patches of grass grew fastest after rain, and which areas of the pasture the cattle preferred in the afternoon heat. She knew the name of the man who had built the original fence and why he had chosen the line he had chosen, and where that choice had been wrong. She was not repeating things she had been told. She was telling him things she had figured out herself, from observation and trial and error and stubbornness. "You do all of this yourself?" he asked when they reached the far end of the south pasture and stopped at the fence line overlooking a shallow draw. "I have 2 ranch hands," she said. "Brothers, Pete and Clem Dawson. They work 3 days a week because that is all I can currently afford to pay them. The rest I do myself." "Your father," Ezekiel said carefully. "He left you with all of this." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the draw rather than at him. "My father was not a malicious man," she said. "He was a man who made very bad decisions and loved his daughter very much, and those 2 things were completely separate rooms in his character that never communicated with each other. He left me the land because he wanted me to have it. He did not tell me about the debt because he was going to fix it first, and then there would be nothing to tell." She paused. "He always believed he was 1 hand away from fixing everything." "I am sorry," Ezekiel said. She looked at him then, and it was a look that was measuring something she had not been measuring before. "You say that like you mean it," she said. "I do mean it. Most men who come in Mr. Beaumont's name do not express sympathy," she said. "They express impatience. Once one of them expressed mild contempt, but I did not find that useful, so I asked him to leave." Ezekiel did smile then, and it was a real one, the kind that came without permission. "You asked him to leave." "He went," she said, with a small, dignified lift of her chin. "Men are sometimes more reasonable than they appear when you address them plainly and hold a fence post with some confidence." He laughed. It surprised him, coming out of him. He could not remember the last time he had laughed on a job. They walked back toward the house, and the afternoon was beginning to tilt toward evening, the light going gold and warm, and Ezekiel was aware that he had not done anything he had come here to do, and he was also aware that he was not in a particular hurry to remedy that. "Stay for supper," Susan said, and it was not quite an invitation, it was more like a practical observation. "You have ridden a long way, and the road back to town is better in the morning anyway. I have a pot of beans started and there is bread." He should have said he needed to be getting back. He said, "Thank you. I will." Supper was beans and corn bread and a jar of preserved peaches from the previous summer that she produced from the cellar with the pleased air of someone who has been saving something for the right occasion. They ate at the kitchen table with the ledger pushed to one side and the evening light coming through the window, and they talked. Not about the debt. They had said what needed to be said about the debt, and the rest would wait. They talked about other things. She asked him where he was from, and he said Virginia originally. Before the war changed enough things that he had headed west at 19 with nothing but a horse and a set of skills that turned out to be somewhat more adaptable to the frontier than he would have predicted. He told her about the 11 years of traveling the territories, the debts and the debtors, the towns that all looked a little bit like this one from certain angles, and all had something in the character of their particular dust that was completely their own. He told her about a negotiation in New Mexico that had turned absurd so fast he had nearly fallen off his horse laughing, before remembering he was supposed to be serious about his profession. She told him about growing up on this land, her mother having died when Susan was 9, her father having done his best in the years after, which sometimes looked like teaching her to shoe a horse and sometimes looked like disappearing into town for 3 days and coming back with empty pockets and full apologies. She told him about teaching herself to read accounts by going through every paper in her father's desk one summer when she was 16, because she had discovered that no one was going to explain the family finances to her, and the only alternative to ignorance was to educate herself. She had taught herself double-entry bookkeeping from a commercial arithmetic textbook and had never looked back. "You are not what I was told to expect," Ezekiel said, and then regretted the phrasing because it implied something about how she had been described. She raised an eyebrow. "What were you told to expect?" He considered lying. It seemed beneath the quality of the evening. A simple ranch girl, probably in over her head, likely to fold when pressed. She looked at him for a moment and then she said, That is a description of a woman who does not exist at this property. What Mr. Beaumont was told about me and what is actually true about me are apparently not the same thing." "Apparently not," Ezekiel agreed. She refilled his coffee and said, "Does it change anything, what you actually found compared to what you were sent to find?" "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "It changes the information I'm working with. Whether it changes the outcome depends on Beaumont." "And on you," she said plainly. "And on me," he agreed. He slept that night in the barn, on a bedroll that she brought out with the brisk hospitality of someone who had housed working men before and had a system for it. The hay was dry, and the barn was warm in the way that animals make any enclosed space warm, and Ezekiel lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling of the barn and thought about Susan Wainwright's ledger and Susan Wainwright's land and Susan Wainwright's direct brown eyes, and tried to arrange his thoughts into something professional and manageable. He was not particularly successful. In the morning she was already up when he came out, and she had eggs from her chickens scrambled and coffee on, and she did not make any ceremony of the breakfast. She simply set a plate in front of him when he came in and went back to doing something at the counter with the ease of someone comfortable in their own space with company in it. "I need to go back to Amarillo," he said. "I will speak to Beaumont." "I am not asking you to advocate for me," she said, over her shoulder. "I am only asking that you give him accurate information." "He will send someone else," Ezekiel said. "If I give him accurate information and he still wants the land, he will send someone else, and that person may not be as interested in accuracy." She turned and looked at him. "I know," she said. "I have thought about that possibility." "Have you thought about what you would do if that happens?" "I have thought about several things," she said. "I have thought about the law, though I am not optimistic that the law in Amarillo is any more independent of men like Silas Beaumont than the law in most places tends to be. I have thought about my neighbor Mr. Aldridge, who is a decent man and would not like to see this land go to a city broker. I have thought about a number of things. But my best option remains November." He ate her eggs and drank her coffee and looked at the books on her shelf, and thought that there was something genuinely unfair about the fact that a woman who had done everything right was sitting on the edge of losing everything because of a man's bad habit at a card table. He had seen plenty of unfairness in his career. He had generally treated it the way he treated the weather, as a condition you worked within rather than one you argued with. This morning, for reasons he was not entirely ready to examine, it felt different. "I will come back," he said when he stood to leave, "before I deliver my report to Beaumont. I want to see the place once more." She looked at him steadily. "Why?" "To make sure my information is current," he said. She looked at him for a long moment in the way she had of looking at things, as though she was reading the actual print beneath the surface presentation, and then she said, "All right, Mr. Wilcox, I will be here." He rode back into Dusty Creek and spent the night at the only boarding house in town, operated by a stout and cheerful widow named Mrs. Pierce, who fed her boarders like it was her personal mission to counteract all the deprivation the Texas Panhandle had ever inflicted on anyone. Over dinner she gave him the full history of Dusty Creek in the enthusiastic, freewheeling way of someone who had been collecting information for decades and found all of it equally fascinating. And in the course of this history, she told him that Harold Wainwright had been a gentle man who everyone had liked very much, and that his daughter Susan had been running that ranch since she was about 22, and doing a considerably better job of it than Harold ever had, God rest him. And that it would be a crying shame if some city fellow came and took it all away just because Harold had made his usual kind of poor decision. Ezekiel went to bed thinking about all of that and woke up in the morning having made a decision that he recognized was going to complicate things considerably. He rode back to the Wainwright place not 2 weeks later, as he had said, and found Susan repairing a section of fence on the north pasture with Pete Dawson, a rangy young man of about 20 who nodded at Ezekiel with the cautious reserve of someone protecting a person he was loyal to. Susan looked up from the fence post and said, "You came back." "I said I would," Ezekiel said. "People say many things," she said, but there was something in the way she said it that was different from skepticism, more like a person noting that an exception had been made and acknowledging it. He helped with the fence. This was not a professional decision. He simply got off his horse and picked up the roll of wire and held it while Susan attached it to the post with the practiced efficiency she brought to every physical task, and they worked their way along the fence line in the warm morning air while Pete watched with visible bewilderment and Cardinal cropped grass contentedly by the gate. "I spoke to Beaumont," Ezekiel said, while they worked. "And he was not interested in November," he said. "He wants the money within 60 days or he will move on the land." She did not stop working. She pulled the wire taut and fastened it and moved to the next post. 60 days, she said. "I pushed for 90, Ezekiel said. "He would not go past 60. 60 days puts us in June, she said. "I will not have the spring cattle sold by June. The market does not come up until July." "I know," Ezekiel said. She stopped then and looked at him. The sun was past 10 o'clock and the light was hard and bright, and it lit the side of her face in a way that made her look simultaneously very strong and very tired. Not the tired of someone who had given up, but the tired of someone who had not stopped moving long enough for the difficulty of what she was doing to fully register. "What are you not saying?" she asked. He had been working up to this and had not yet found an elegant approach, so he abandoned the search for elegance and said it plainly. "I propose to Beaumont that the debt be restructured as a mortgage against the property, at reasonable interest, with payment over 3 years. He refused. Then I proposed that I personally purchase the debt from Beaumont at a discount which would give him cash now and restructure it as I described directly with you." She stared at him. "You proposed to buy my debt." "I proposed it. He accepted eventually." He was not enthusiastic about anything other than the full sum immediately, but he is also a pragmatic man, and cash now, even at a discount, is more certain than a contested property in a county where he does not have the relationships he would need to move quickly. "Mr. Wilcox," she said, and her voice was very careful. "Why would you do that?" This was the part he had also been preparing for and had not been able to fully prepare for. He looked at the fence post, and then at Cardinal, and then at Susan Wainwright, and he said, "Because the numbers in your ledger are sound. Because by November you will have the money. Because it is a better investment than letting Beaumont take land worth 3 times the debt and sell it for half of that. And because it is the right thing to do." She was quiet for a long moment. Pete Dawson had found something very interesting to look at in the direction that was not them. "You said because it is the right thing to do last," she said. "Yes. I noticed that," she said. "I thought you might." She looked at him for a moment longer, and then she said, with a quietness that was very different from the composed, professional quietness he had heard from her before, "I am not a charity case, Mr. Wilcox." "I know that," he said. "I have seen your ledger and your land and your fences and your drainage work, and I know that better than Silas Beaumont ever will. I am not offering you charity. I am offering you a business arrangement with reasonable terms. The terms are these. You pay me what you owe Beaumont at the rate you projected in November with interest at 5%, and you pay it when you have it and not before." She absorbed this. "And if I cannot pay it by November?" "Then we renegotiate," he said, "as people do." She looked at him for a very long time. The wind moved through the dry grass around the fence post, and somewhere far off a hawk was riding a thermal in the blue sky. "Why are you doing this?" she said again, and this time it was a different question, the one underneath the practical one, and they both knew it. "I have been asking myself the same thing," he said honestly. That was not quite an answer, and they both knew that too, but she accepted it with a small nod. And then she picked up the roll of wire and they went back to working on the fence. And Ezekiel was aware that something had shifted between them in a way that would not shift back. He stayed in Dusty Creek. This was not the plan. The plan had been to come back, confirm the arrangement, and return to Amarillo to wait for November. Instead he stayed. He told himself it was practical, that he should be available if Beaumont decided to contest the arrangement, that the investment warranted proximity. He was a reasonably honest man in most matters, and he was aware that these justifications were true as far as they went and did not go nearly as far as he needed them to. Mrs. Pierce at the boarding house was delighted to have him for an extended stay, and negotiated a weekly rate with the cheerful confidence of a woman who knew her market. Dusty Creek was small enough that his continued presence was noticed and discussed, which he was aware of and could not much about. The postmaster, a leathery man named Garrett who also served as the informal news bureau of the town, gave Ezekiel a long, assessing look the second week and said, "You still here, then?" "Still here," Ezekiel agreed. "Business," Garrett said in the tone of a man who already has a theory. "Among other things," Ezekiel said, which gave Garrett exactly as much to work with as Ezekiel intended, which was more than nothing and less than everything. He rode out to the Wainwright ranch 3 times that first week and 4 times the second, and Susan Wainwright did not say anything about the frequency of his visits, but she also did not say he should visit less, and she always had coffee, and she always showed him whatever she was working on, with the ease of someone who had grown accustomed to having a particular person around and found the habit agreeable. On a Thursday toward the end of April, he arrived to find her attempting to fix the water pump behind the house, which had developed a leak in the cylinder and was not a simple repair. She had the pump partially disassembled, and her hands and forearms were dark with grease, and she was studying a part she had just removed with an expression of concentrated analysis that he had seen on engineers and was not accustomed to seeing on anyone he had been sent to collect a debt from. "I can look at that," he said. "I have almost got it," she said. "I know you have almost got it," he said. "But I am here and I have nothing more important to do, and 2 pairs of eyes are better than 1 on a pump cylinder." She handed him the part. He looked at it, found the crack, and they had a 15-minute conversation about the best way to address it that ranged through 3 possible approaches, and eventually landed on one that worked, which they implemented together over the course of an hour, trading tools and observations with the comfortable efficiency of people who have worked alongside each other longer than they actually had. When the pump was running again and she had tested it and they had washed the grease off their hands at the basin, she said, "You are not what I expected either." "What did you expect?" he said. "A man who comes to collect a debt," she said. "They are usually a specific type." "And I'm a different type." "You are," she said, with the particular care of someone selecting exact words. "You are a man who reads ledgers carefully and holds ladders and fixes pumps and comes back when he says he will come back. Those are specific qualities," he said. "I am a specific person," she said, and there was something in that, a humor and a warmth that was different from her professional composure, and he found he wanted very much to be someone who brought more of it out of her. May came in warm and busy, and the Wainwright ranch was at its most demanding, and Ezekiel, who had made no formal arrangement and taken no formal position, found himself present most days, helping with the work that needed doing. He helped Pete and Clem Dawson repair the barn roof. He helped move cattle to the east pasture for the spring growth. He drove Susan into Dusty Creek twice a week when she needed supplies, and on those drives they talked about everything and nothing, the kind of conversation that was not particularly consequential on its surface, but was doing something underneath. The way a river does its real work, not at the surface where you can see it, but in the deep current below. He told her about his family in Virginia, his mother who had died in 1870, and his 2 brothers who had gone different directions after the war, one back to farming, and one into a kind of restlessness that had eventually taken him to California. He told her about what it was like to ride into a strange town and be looked at as a threat before anyone had exchanged a word, and how that had made him a particular kind of careful about first impressions. He told her about a summer in Colorado when he had gotten completely turned around in the mountains and spent 3 days finding his way back to the nearest trail and what he had thought about, in those 3 days, which was his life, and whether it contained enough that was worth something. She told him about a winter when she was 23, when the herd had gotten into trouble during a late freeze, and she had spent 2 days and nights in the field, barely sleeping, keeping the cattle moving and the ice broken from the water troughs, alone because her father had been unable to rise from his bed with a fever. She had saved most of the herd. She had come back to the house at the end of it so tired she had sat down on the porch steps and simply stayed there for an hour before she could make herself go inside. "I remember thinking," she said, "that if I could get through that, I could get through anything." Which was probably not a sophisticated conclusion, but it was a useful one. "It is a true one," Ezekiel said. "It has proven to be," she said. It was on a Saturday afternoon in the middle of May that the thing that had been building between them came to its first surface, and it happened, as most true things in that kind of story do, not dramatically but quietly, in the middle of an ordinary moment. They were sitting on the porch after a long day, both of them tired in the satisfied way of people who have done physical work in good weather. She had a glass of cold water. He had his hat off, which he rarely did outside, and his dark hair was going every direction from a day of being pressed under it. The evening light was the particular gold of the Texas panhandle at that hour, a light that made the ordinary landscape look briefly magnificent, the dry grass silver and amber, the far ridge painted in colors that had no precise name. "Ezekiel," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, and something in the way she said it was as deliberate as everything else she did. He looked at her. "I need to say something to you, and I need to say it plainly because that is the only way I know how to say things," she said. "All right," he said. "I do not know what you are doing here," she said. "I mean, I know the practical reason, the debt and the arrangement, but I also know that is not the whole of it, and I think you know that too. And I have been thinking about that, what the rest of it is, and I find that my thinking on the subject is not entirely objective." He turned slightly toward her on the porch steps. The light caught the side of her face, and she was looking at him with the full directness of someone who has decided to be honest even when honesty is a risk. "I came here for a professional reason," he said. "That is true. And what happened after I arrived is that I found something I was not expecting to find, which is you, specifically as you are, and I have been making a great many professional-sounding arguments to myself for why I am still here, and they are all true and none of them is the real reason." She was quiet for a moment. "What is the real reason?" she asked. "I want to be here," he said. "I want to be near you. I find that I think about this place when I am not in it, and I find that what I am thinking about is not the land or the investment." He stopped himself from looking away, which was his first instinct, and held her gaze instead. "I recognize that this is an unusual situation. I recognize that I came here in a capacity that was not exactly in your favor and that any feeling you might have about that is reasonable." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then she said, "I am not confused about what you did or why. You had a professional task. You performed it honestly. You found a problem you could fix that was not your problem to fix, and you fixed it anyway. And you came back when you said you would. And you have been here for a month being useful in ways that no one asked you to be and that you clearly did not need to be." She paused. "I am not a woman who makes a great deal of room for feeling, generally speaking. I was taught that feeling got in the way of function, and I have lived by that because I had to. But I find, in your particular case, that the feeling is not getting in the way of anything. It is adding to things." Ezekiel Wilcox was a man who had navigated 11 years of other people's complicated problems with a certain professional composure that was not coldness, but was a deliberate management of the self. And in that moment on Susan Wainwright's porch in the gold light of a May evening, all of that management stepped politely aside, and what was underneath it was something warm and certain, and not small at all. "Susan," he said, and then reached out and covered her hand where it rested on the step between them, and she turned her hand over and held his with the grip of someone who has decided on something. And the sun finished its slide toward the horizon, and the first stars came up over the panhandle. And they sat on the porch steps holding hands in the dark until the night got cool enough to go inside. June brought the dry heat and also brought the spring cattle sale at the county seat 20 miles east. And Susan drove her 12 head to market with Pete and Clem, and Ezekiel riding alongside. The cattle market was exactly what Dusty Creek's small world looked like when it gathered together. A sprawl of corrals and dust and men in various states of hat and opinion. A few dozen ranchers and their hands. The livestock commission buyers from Amarillo and Lubbock. And the particular commerce of the panhandle working itself out in the open air. Susan knew what her cattle were worth, and she sold them accordingly, which meant she did not accept the first offer she received, which was low, or the second, which was slightly less low, but negotiated a third through a conversation with the commission buyer that Ezekiel watched with the full attention of someone witnessing a skilled performance. She was not aggressive or theatrical. She was precise. She knew the weight, the condition, the market comparables, and she stated them clearly and held her position. And the buyer, who was accustomed to ranch owners either folding or bluffing badly, encountered someone doing neither and adjusted his offer accordingly. She came away with a figure that covered a significant portion of the debt and banked it that afternoon at the small bank in the county seat with the composed satisfaction of someone crossing a substantial item off a list. On the drive back to Dusty Creek in the wagon, with the day cooling around them and the wide country going soft in the evening light, she said, 2 more cattle sales in the fall crop and the Aldridge lease. That is what remains. You will get there, he said. I know, she said. It was not arrogance, it was calculation. I have the numbers. He looked at her in profile against the evening sky, the strong line of her face, the escaped strand of auburn hair that had lost its battle with the wind somewhere around noon, and felt with the certainty that had been building in him since April that he did not want to go back to Amarillo in November. He wanted, with a clarity that was unusual for him, something permanent. He had not said that yet. He was working up to it with the same care he brought to everything important. July was the hottest month, as it always was, and the work on the Wainwright ranch entered its most demanding phase. The kitchen garden needed constant attention against the heat. The cattle required water management across the pastures. The south acreage, the drainage project that had consumed so much of the spring, needed final work on its eastern channel to handle the summer thunderstorm runoff that came through in July and August. Ezekiel worked. He was not a man who had shied from physical labor, despite years of a profession that was more mind than body, and he found that the physical work of the ranch, the building and fixing and hauling and mending, was doing something for him that he had not realized he needed. He began to understand, traveling for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be in one place long enough to know it. To know where the tools were kept, to know which gate stuck and needed lifting as you pushed, to know that the best light on the property came at about 4 in the afternoon when the sun angled through the space between the hill to the west and the barn roof and made the whole yard glow. He knew this place now, and he found that he wanted to know it for a very long time. There were practical things to manage. He wrote to his employer in Amarillo, who was not technically his employer since he worked on commission and retained his independence, but who relied on him regularly. He explained that he had a personal situation in the Panhandle that required him to be in residence for the summer. His employer wrote back with the mild displeasure of a man who was inconvenienced and the pragmatic acceptance of a man who could not compel someone who worked for himself. He would wait, or he would find someone else for the jobs that came up in the meantime. Ezekiel found that he did not feel the professional anxiety about this that he might have felt 6 months ago. On a Sunday evening in late July, when the heat had finally broken toward evening, and a thin breeze was coming up from the south, Susan and Ezekiel sat on the porch after supper with coffee, and the specific comfortable quiet of people who had been working alongside each other long enough to be easy in silence. "I have been thinking," he said. "That is generally apparent when you are about to say something," she said, which was her humor, dry and precise and aimed accurately. "I have been thinking about November," he said. She looked at him. "When you pay the debt," he said, "my professional reason for being here resolves, and I have been thinking about what I want to happen after that." "What do you want to happen?" she said. He turned to face her directly, with the same refusal to look away that he had insisted on in himself in April. "I want to stay," he said. "I want to stay here on this land with you. I want to be useful to you not because I have a financial interest in the ranch's success, but because I want to build something here. I want to stop traveling. I have been on the road since I was 19, and I have seen most of what the territories have to show a man, and none of it looks like what I want as much as this does." Susan set down her coffee cup on the porch rail and looked at him for a long time. The evening was very still. In the west, the last light was fading from gold to rose. "That is a great deal to say," she said. "I know," he said. "I have been thinking it for a while." "Since when?" she asked. "Since May," he said. "The fence work. When I realized I knew where you kept the wire cutters without having to ask." She almost smiled. "Almost. Knowing where I keep my tools is not the most romantic basis for a life decision," she said. "It is a true one," he said. "And I am trying to be true to you, Susan. I am not a man who is good at the sentimental kind of speech. I am a man who knows what something is worth and how to tell the difference between something that matters and something that does not, and I am telling you that this matters to me. You matter to me. This land and this life and what you are building here matters to me, and I want to be part of it." She was quiet for a long moment. The rose light in the west faded to a deep blue and the stars began to appear, the immense stars of the Panhandle where there was nothing to compete with them. "Ezekiel," she said, "I am going to say something that may sound strange." "All right," he said. "I did not expect any of this," she said. "I did not expect you. I expected, when Mr. Beaumont's man came, to have the most difficult conversation of my life about the most difficult problem I had ever been handed. And then you came and held the ladder and read my ledger honestly, and came back when you said you would and fixed the water pump, and stayed through the fence work, and the cattle sale, and the drainage channel, and the July heat. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I stopped thinking of you as a professional complication and started thinking of you as the person I most wanted to talk to about whatever I was looking at. That is," Ezekiel said carefully, "a very good thing for me to hear." "I know it is," she said, with the small dignified certainty that was so much herself. "I am saying it because it is true and because you deserve to know it." She looked at him steadily. "I want you to stay too. I want that very much. But I need you to be certain because this is hard work and this land asks everything of a person, and I will not have you here if you are going to discover in February that you miss the road." "I will not miss the road," he said. "How do you know?" He thought about that. He thought about all the roads and all the towns and all the boarding houses and all the faces of debtors and creditors across 11 years of traveling. And he thought about this particular porch and this particular woman, and the fact that the prospect of riding away from it in November had been sitting in his chest for weeks like something that did not belong there. "Because I have been missing something for years," he said, "and I have been on the road the whole time and it has not been there, and since April it has been here. I know the difference." She held his gaze for one more long moment, and then she reached across the space between them and took his hand, the same gesture as May, but different now, more complete, with the weight of everything they had said since then in it. "Then stay," she said. He stayed. August was full and demanding, and Golden and Ezekiel was part of every day of it. He was not a man who inserted himself without purpose, and he found the purpose readily, because there was always something the ranch needed, and he had learned enough about what it needed to be genuinely useful rather than symbolically present. He and Pete Dawson developed an uncomplicated working friendship built on a shared approach to problems, and a mutual appreciation for Susan's competence, and a complete absence of unnecessary conversation. Clem Dawson was younger and more talkative, and regarded Ezekiel with a combination of wariness and curiosity that gradually resolved into something warmer as the weeks went on. The town of Dusty Creek had formed its conclusions about the situation at the Wainwright Ranch by this point, and those conclusions ranged from warmly approving to mildly skeptical in proportions that generally reflected each person's existing opinion of Susan Wainwright, which was itself generally high. Mrs. Pierce had moved from pleased border management to active matchmaking commentary, expressing her views on the subject to anyone who would listen, and several people who were trying not to. The postmaster Garrett had simply nodded at Ezekiel one morning and said, "Good for her," which Ezekiel took as an endorsement of real value. The Aldridge family, whose patriarch John Aldridge was the neighbor to the south, came to visit in mid-August, a visit that had the character of an inspection, because John Aldridge had known Harold Wainwright and had known Susan since she was a child, and had been watching the situation since Harold's death with the concerned attention of someone close enough to help and careful enough not to offer help that was not wanted. He was a big, weathered man in his 50s who looked at Ezekiel for a long, quiet time before extending his hand and saying, "She says you have been useful." "I have tried to be," Ezekiel said. "Useful is what this place needs," Aldridge said, shaking his hand. "Are you going to stay useful or are you going to move on?" "I am going to stay," Ezekiel said. Aldridge looked at him a moment longer and then said, "Good," and that seemed to be the end of the evaluation. He and his wife Miriam and their 2 adult sons sat for supper that evening, and the conversation was lively and ranging, and Ezekiel found himself, somewhere between the pie and the coffee, thinking that this was what a community was, not the formal structures of it but the living habit of people who had been near each other through difficulty and had come to rely on that nearness. At the end of August, Ezekiel rode to the county seat and returned with certain legal documents that he had arranged through the county recorder, and he sat down with Susan at the kitchen table where they had first discussed the debt and laid them on the table between them. "These formalize the debt arrangement," he said. "The terms we agreed in writing, properly recorded. Your payment schedule, the interest rate, the final payment date. It is legally binding and protects you as much as it protects the investment." She read every word of the document because she always read every word and asked 2 clarifying questions, and then she signed it with her careful, distinctive hand, and he signed it as well, and she looked at both signatures on the page for a moment and then put the document in the tin box on the high shelf where she kept the important papers. "Thank you," she said. "For making the arrangement," he said. "For making it something real and recorded," she said. "Not a verbal understanding that could be argued about later, something real. Everything I intend to do here," he said, "I intend to be real." She looked at him, and something in her expression was softer than he had seen it, the particular softness of someone who has been braced for a long time and has slowly, carefully, lowered the brace. September arrived with the beginning of the fall feeling in the air, the mornings cooler, the light changing quality, and the ranch turning its attention toward harvest and preparation for winter. The kitchen garden produced abundantly in September, and Susan and Miriam Aldridge spent 2 days together putting up vegetables in glass jars, filling the cellar with the stored wealth of the summer, and Ezekiel spent those same 2 days helping John Aldridge and his sons begin the fall fence inspection of both properties, a job that needed doing and was better done with company. It was on one of those September evenings, when the preserving was done and the fence inspection was done, and the Aldridges had gone home and Pete and Clem had finished their work and ridden back to town, that Ezekiel came in from washing up at the basin to find Susan sitting at the kitchen table with the almanac open and a piece of paper beside it, working out something. She looked up when he came in, and there was a quality to her expression that he had learned over the summer to read. She was not worried, but she was thinking hard about something. "What is it?" he said. "October and November," she said. "I am running the final projections." The fall crop sale next month, the Aldridge lease payment on the 1st of November, and then we will see where we are. He sat across from her. Show me. She turned the paper so he could see it, and they worked through the numbers together. The same two people who had worked through a different set of numbers at this same table in April, but completely different in how they sat, how they moved, how they spoke to each other with the ease of people who had become essential to one another without making a formal announcement of it. The numbers were good. By November they would have it. You were right, Ezekiel said. About which part? She said. Every part, he said. The drainage work paid off, the spring sale went well, the fall crop looks strong, the Aldridge lease is a reliable piece of the equation. Every decision you made was correct. She looked at the numbers and said, I needed time. That was the only thing I needed. Time, he agreed, and someone to hold the ladder. She looked at him across the table. I have been thinking about something, she said. All right, he said. She folded her hands on the table in the composed gesture he had seen at their first meeting, and had come to understand was her preparing herself to say something that mattered to her. I have been thinking about the future, she said. About what the ranch looks like in 2 years and in 5. About whether 20 acres is the right size to be working or whether there are opportunities to expand carefully. She paused. And I have been thinking about those questions as questions for 2 people rather than 1. I have been assuming these past months that that is what we are building toward, but I have not said it plainly, and I think it deserves to be said plainly. It does, he said. I think we should get married, she said, with the directness that was so completely her own. I think we suit each other. I think we work well together in every sense. I think we make each other better at what we do. And I think I love you, which I recognize is perhaps the order in which that list should have been presented. But you know by now that I am a person who comes at things from the practical side first. He looked at her for a moment. This woman who had been on a rooftop with a hammer when he first arrived, and had handed him an honestly prepared ledger, and negotiated a cattle buyer to a fair price, and fixed a water pump, and built a working drainage system with her own hands, and read every word of a legal document before signing it, and said what she meant with a precision that was one of the most beautiful things he had ever encountered. And he said, I love you too, Susan. I have been certain of it since June, and I have been working up to saying it properly. You have been taking your time, she said, with a hint of warmth in it. I wanted to be sure I was saying it at the right moment, he said. Is this the right moment? It is a very good moment, he said. Yes, and yes to the marriage, and yes to the 2 years and the 5 years and the expansion plans, which I have thoughts on if you would like to hear them. I would like very much to hear them, she said. But perhaps not right at this precise second. He stood up from the table and came around to her side, and she stood to meet him. And he took her face in his hands the way he had been wanting to do since May, and kissed her with the full certainty of a man who has found the thing he was looking for, and is not inclined to be ambiguous about it. And she kissed him back with the same wholehearted precision she brought to everything. And the September evening was very quiet outside, and the cellar was full of preserved summer, and the numbers on the paper on the table were good. They were married in October at the small church in Dusty Creek by a minister named Reverend Cole, who performed the ceremony with the brisk warmth of a man who had seen enough people together to know when it was right. The whole of Dusty Creek came, or close enough to it that the church was full, and people stood outside the open windows in the mild October air. Mrs. Pierce cried freely and made no apologies for it. Garrett, the postmaster, stood in the back and nodded with great satisfaction. The Aldridges sat in the front row, Miriam Aldridge also crying, John Aldridge looking pleased in a way that involved no change in expression, but was somehow perfectly legible. Pete and Clem Dawson, cleaned up and somewhat uncomfortable in their good shirts, stood in the yard and grinned when the couple came out of the church, and Pete pumped Ezekiel's hand in a grip that made several things clear about how seriously he took his loyalty to Susan Wainwright, now Susan Wilcox, and what he expected in return. The reception was at the Wainwright Ranch, food provided by what seemed like every woman in the county, and it went until the stars were well up, and the night was cold and full of laughter and fiddle music, because someone had brought a fiddle, and someone else knew how to play it, and the yard in front of the ranch house was lit with lanterns, and people danced on the packed dirt in the particular joyful, unsophisticated way of people who do not dance much and are very glad to have the occasion. Susan danced with her husband in the lantern light and looked up at him and said, with a humor that was also entirely genuine, "You came to collect a debt." "I did," he said. "And this is what happened," she said. "This is what happened," he agreed, and turned her through the next figure of the dance while the fiddle played on into the Texas night. November came, and with it the Aldridge lease payment and the final figures of the fall crop, and Susan sat down at the kitchen table with Ezekiel and the ledger and the tin box of important documents and worked through the final numbers, and they were sufficient. They were more than sufficient. There was, after the debt payment was made in full, enough left to begin the repair of the north barn roof that had been on the list all year. She took out the document they had both signed and set it on the table and wrote the paid-in-full notation in her careful hand with the date and signed it, and Ezekiel signed beside her, and she put it back in the tin box with a decisiveness that was the close of one thing and the beginning of another. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. She looked at him across the table and he looked at her, this woman who was his wife, in this house that was becoming his home, on this land that they were working together, and there was between them the particular deep quiet of people who have settled something important. "Now," she said, "you said you had thoughts on the expansion." He did. He had been thinking about it since September, and had done a reasonable amount of research in the county records at the county seat regarding the parcels adjacent to the south acreage. There was 20 acres to the southeast that had been sitting unworked for 3 years following the death of its previous owner, and it could be had at a price that their combined resources, his savings from 11 years of commission work and her debt-free ranch income going forward, could manage within 2 years. They talked about it for 2 hours at the kitchen table, the same table where everything important seemed to happen. And the plan that emerged was careful and realistic and ambitious in exactly the way that Susan Wainwright's plans always were, grounded in numbers and projected forward into what was actually achievable rather than what was theoretically desirable. The winter of 1882 was cold but manageable, and they were snowed in together for a week in December with nothing more urgent to do than tend the stock and keep the fire and read and talk. And Ezekiel discovered that being snowed in with Susan was one of the more thoroughly enjoyable experiences available to him, because she was excellent company, and her collection of books was better than he had expected. And she was interested in everything he had to say about them, and had things to say herself that were worth hearing. She was reading Middlemarch, which she had read before but returned to at intervals, and she read him a passage one evening that she said she had always thought was particularly true, and he listened to it and agreed, and they had a long conversation about it that ranged through the particulars of the novel and out the other side into questions about how people understood each other and what it required. And it was the kind of conversation he had not expected to have in the Texas Panhandle, and had not expected to want to have as much as he did. "You are full of surprises," he told her, one evening in January when the fire was low and the wind was loud outside and they were reading in the small, comfortable warmth of the main room. She looked at him over her book. "I told you I was a specific person," she said. "You did," he said. "I did not fully appreciate what that meant until I had the evidence." She lowered her book slightly. "Is that a good thing?" "It is the best thing," he said. She looked at him for a moment with the warmth she showed him now without the careful management she had applied to it in the beginning, and then she went back to her book, and he went back to his, and the wind blew and the fire burned low and warm. Spring came again in 1883, the 1-year mark of Ezekiel's arrival in Dusty Creek, and it came with news that Susan told him on a March morning with the quality of someone who has confirmed something they suspected, and is deciding how to present it. She told him in the kitchen, straightforwardly, with a small smile that was entirely different from her usual composed expression, different in the particular way of someone holding something wonderful. He stood very still for a moment, processing it, and then he crossed the kitchen and took her hands in both of his and said, "Are you well? How are you feeling?" "I am perfectly well," she said, with the characteristic precision of a woman who would know the difference. "I feel entirely capable of continuing to work this ranch before you form any protective notions." "I am not forming protective notions," he said, which was not entirely true. "I am very glad." "So am I," she said, and her smile was fully there now, open and real and complete, and he thought it was one of the finest things he had ever seen. The news spread through Dusty Creek with the efficient velocity that all news in small towns travels, carried largely by Mrs. Pierce, who treated the information as both personally exciting and a professional obligation to share. The Aldridges came over with food, and Miriam Aldridge hugged Susan with a warmth that involved some firmly suppressed emotion, and John Aldridge shook Ezekiel's hand and said, "Good," again, which was his preferred expression for things he found genuinely right. Pete and Clem Dawson were promoted to 4 days a week, which had been the plan regardless of the news, but which the news made more clearly the right move, and the ranch entered its second spring with expanded purpose, and a schedule that Ezekiel and Susan planned together with the same meticulous collaborative attention they brought to everything. The South Acreage expansion, the 20 acres to the southeast, was negotiated and purchased in May of 1883, a year ahead of their original projection, because the winter had been good for savings, and the previous year's accounts had come in better than predicted. Susan signed the deed with the satisfaction of a person crossing something off a list they have been maintaining since before the list was written down. The summer of 1883 was the most demanding and the fullest. The expanded range needed fencing, which Ezekiel led with Pete and 2 additional day laborers hired through the county. The kitchen garden was expanded in anticipation of the winter's new demands. The drainage system on the South Acreage was extended to incorporate the newly acquired land, because the same drainage characteristics applied, and Susan had already analyzed them in her usual thorough way. She worked through the summer with the same energy she had always had, modified only by the practical concessions that necessity required, a subject on which Ezekiel learned very early to express his opinions with care, and to accept with good nature that Susan Wainwright Wilcox was an authority on her own body's capabilities, and would thank him for his concern, and then do what she had already decided was the right course of action. He was present in the way that mattered, not hovering but available, not managing but supporting, and in the evenings they sat on the porch in the warm summer dark and talked about everything that was happening and everything that would happen. And it was the kind of life that Ezekiel had not known he was building toward through 11 years of traveling, and had now, with the satisfaction of a completed journey, arrived at. Their son was born in October of 1883, delivered by the county doctor who came out from the seat in his buggy and handled the matter with competent efficiency. He was a healthy, loud, substantial boy who arrived with the apparent conviction that the world owed him immediate attention, a conviction that Ezekiel found both alarming and privately hilarious. Susan, exhausted and completely certain, said, "He is fine. He is going to be very fine," with the assessment of someone who knew what fine looked like, and she was right. They named him Harold James Wilcox, Harold for Susan's father, James for Ezekiel's brother in Virginia. It was a practical choice and also a generous one, the kind of name that carried the weight of the past into the future without apology. Mrs. Pierce came to see the baby and produced a level of emotion that required 2 handkerchiefs. Miriam Aldridge arrived with enough food to see the household through a siege. Garrett the postmaster sent a card, which was his preferred mode of expression and which said simply, "Very good news, best regards, G. Garrett," and which Susan kept in the tin box with the important documents. Pete Dawson looked at the baby with the cautious expression of a young man encountering an infant for the first time and said, "He is loud." And Clem Dawson said, "He is very small," and both observations were accurate. The autumn of 1883 was rich and full, the harvest good, the accounts healthy, the ranch operating at a level of smooth, productive activity that was the result of everything Susan had built before Ezekiel arrived and everything they had built together since. The 60 acres, the original 40 plus the 20 of the new addition, were fenced and grazed and cultivated with the care of people who understood what they had and intended to take care of it. Ezekiel wrote to his brother in California, a letter that was longer than his letters usually were, because there was more to say. He wrote about the land and the work and Susan and the baby and the specific quality of the light in the Texas Panhandle in November, which was unlike any other light he had seen, a clear cold gold that made the distance look impossible and the near things look completely real. He wrote about Dusty Creek and Mrs. Pierce and the Aldridges and Pete and Clem Dawson and Garrett the postmaster and the church where they had been married. He wrote about what it felt like to have arrived somewhere after all the traveling. His brother wrote back and said he was thinking of coming to visit, and the letter had the quality of a man who might mean it, which was more than Ezekiel had expected. The winter of 1883 settled in cold and clear, and Harold James Wilcox, who had arrived with opinions, continued to develop them at a rate his father found impressive, and his mother found entirely predictable. He was a good baby in the sense of being healthy and interested in everything, which meant he was not a quiet baby, but quiet had never been the standard by which things were judged on the Wainwright Ranch. Susan nursed and managed and worked the portions of the ranch that could be managed from inside during the coldest weeks, and Ezekiel handled the outdoor work with Pete during that time, the stock management, and the water and the fence checks that the winter required. They had a system, as they had always had systems, developed through observation and conversation, and the mutual adjustment of two people who were good at figuring out what worked. In the evenings of that winter, Harold James asleep in the cradle that Ezekiel had built in September from good pine, which he had spent 3 weeks on in the evenings after supper, working by lamplight with the care of a man making something that needed to last. They sat by the fire and talked about the coming spring and the plans for the expanded acreage and the possibility of adding to the herd, which the additional range would support. Susan had, as always, done the numbers. The numbers were good. They were, in fact, better than good, because the ranch that Harold Wainwright had left to his daughter with its hidden debt, and its neglected drainage and its complicated legacy had become, through Susan's determination and Ezekiel's presence and their combined refusal to let difficulty have the final word, something that was genuinely prosperous in the modest and real way that prosperity in the Panhandle meant. A working ranch, well-maintained, with healthy animals and good land and solid accounts, and people who knew what they were doing. "I want to tell you something," Ezekiel said, one evening in January when the fire was bright and the cradle was still and the cold outside was the deep clean cold of a clear Texas winter night. Susan looked up from the ledger she was reviewing. "All right. I came here a year and a half ago," he said, "to collect a debt. I had a professional description of the situation that turned out to be entirely wrong, and I had a personal expectation of what the work would involve that was equally wrong, and both of those things being wrong was the best thing that has ever happened to me." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You have told me a version of this before." "I know," he said. "I wanted to tell you this version, which is the one that includes the cradle and Harold James and the 60 acres, and the fact that I know where you keep the wire cutters, and I know that the morning light on this house comes best from the east, and I know how you take your coffee, and I know what your face looks like when you are about to say something that matters, and I know that I am going to know all of these things for the rest of my life, and I am glad about that in a way that is larger than I can say precisely." She set the ledger aside and looked at him across the fire, and her expression was the open one, the fully open one with nothing managed and nothing held back, the one he had been privileged to see more and more of over the months, and she said, "I am glad too, Ezekiel. More than you know, which is a significant thing to say to a man who reads people for a living." He laughed, and she smiled, and Harold James chose this moment to announce his continued existence from the cradle, and the evening became the practical managed warmth of parents attending to a baby, which was its own kind of love, unglamorous and immediate and entirely real. Spring came to the Texas Panhandle in 1884 with its usual combination of beauty and demand, and the Wilcox Ranch entered its busiest season with everything in order. The South acreage was fully integrated into the operation. The herd was expanded by 8 head good breeding stock purchased through a contact of John Aldridge's at a reasonable price. The kitchen garden was planted on the first warm day by Susan and young Harold James, who was old enough by then to sit in the dirt and make his views known about everything within reach. Ezekiel's brother did come, in May of 1884, arriving on the stage from Amarillo with a carpetbag and the cautious curiosity of a man who had been hearing about a place and a woman and a baby for 7 months and has decided to see for himself. His name was Daniel. He was 3 years younger than Ezekiel, and he had the same gray-green eyes but a different way of wearing them, more open, quicker to humor. He shook Susan's hand and looked around the ranch with the kind of attention that said he was taking it seriously, and then he picked up Harold James with the ease of a man who had handled children before, and Harold James, who was selective about who he permitted to carry him, accepted this without protest, which Susan noted and found informative. Daniel stayed 3 weeks. He helped with the spring work with no prompting and considerable competence, and in the evenings he and Ezekiel and Susan sat on the porch or at the kitchen table and talked in the way of people who are enjoying themselves. On his last evening, Daniel said to Ezekiel privately when they were checking on the horses in the barn before bed, "You found something good here." "I know," Ezekiel said. "You look different," Daniel said. "From when I last saw you, 5 years ago was it, you look like a man who has stopped moving." "I have stopped moving," Ezekiel said. "It suits you," Daniel said. He went back to California with the air of a man who had confirmed something he wanted to confirm, and left behind a standing invitation for them to visit him, which Ezekiel intended to take up when Harold James was old enough for the journey. The summer of 1884 was the rhythm of a life that had found its shape. The days were full of work and purpose. The evenings were the particular richness of people who are tired in the right way and have good company to be tired with. Dusty Creek went on being itself, which meant the postmaster continued to be the town's informal information system. Mrs. Pierce continued to feed everyone who came within range of her establishment. The Aldridges continued to be the kind of neighbors that made the county feel like a community, and the fiddle came out when there was occasion for it, which there regularly was. Harold James Wilcox grew with the enthusiasm of a child who had inherited his mother's interest in everything and his father's habit of taking it seriously, and he was into everything and underfoot constantly and entirely beloved. He said his first clear word in July, which was a version of Cardinal, the horse's name, a priority that Ezekiel found both funny and appropriate. He took his first steps on the porch in August, teetering between his mother's hands and his father's with the concentrated determination of someone who has decided that walking is the next skill and intends to acquire it efficiently. On an evening in the fall of 1884, when the air was cooling and the harvest was nearly done, and the accounts looked strong and Harold James was asleep, and the ranch was settled into the good quiet of a place that is well cared for, Susan sat with Ezekiel on the porch steps where they had sat so many evenings, and the stars were up in the panhandle sky in their vast uncountable numbers, and she said, "I have been doing the numbers again." "What numbers?" he said. "The numbers on a second child," she said, and looked at him sidelong with the smile that was still, every time, one of the finest things he knew. He looked at her. "Those are good numbers," he said. "They are excellent numbers," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and they looked at the stars over the panhandle, over their 60 acres and their good barn, and their healthy herd and their sleeping son, and their ordered accounts and their full cellar and their mended fences. And Ezekiel Wilcox thought about the April morning 16 months ago, when he had ridden into this property expecting to find one thing, and had found something completely different, something that had turned out to be the whole of what he wanted. And he thought that the story of it, if you told it plainly, was the kind of story that sounded unlikely. A debt collector who arrived to collect a bet and found a woman who was so thoroughly not what he had been told to expect that every expectation he had ever had about his own life had quietly reorganized itself around her. It was, he thought, entirely true. And it was, he thought, exactly right. The second child was a girl, born in the summer of 1885, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's curling hair, and a temperament that was from the first entirely her own. They named her Clara Me Wilcox, Clara for no one in particular except that it suited her, and me for Miriam Aldridge, who had been present for so many of the important things that the acknowledgement felt right, and the older woman received it with a composure that lasted exactly until she was alone with John, who reported privately to Ezekiel that there had been considerable emotion involved. Harold James regarded his sister with the mixed interest of a 2-year-old encountering something new and loud in his house, and adjusted to her with the pragmatic flexibility of a child who had inherited, from both parents, the tendency to identify what was real and work with it. He was, within a month, fiercely protective of her, a protectiveness that expressed itself at first in simply being near her and gradually in more active forms as they both grew. The ranch in the year of Clara's birth was 60 acres and a strong herd and a kitchen garden that fed the family and sent surplus to town, and solid accounts that showed 3 years of steady building on a base that Susan had salvaged from disaster and made into something sound. Ezekiel had stopped thinking of himself as having arrived from somewhere else. He had stopped thinking of himself as a man who used to travel. He was a rancher in the Texas Panhandle, with good land and a good wife and 2 good children and neighbors he respected, and a town that knew his name, and the life he had assembled from the unlikely beginning of a debt collection in April of 1882 was in every important measure complete. There were still difficult things, because difficulty does not cease when happiness arrives. It simply stops being the main character. There were dry years and hard winters and the ordinary grief of a community that lost people it loved. And there was the particular grief when John Aldridge died in the winter of 1886, quietly, in his sleep, which was the kind of death that did not feel like enough ceremony for a man who had been so solidly present in life. Susan and Ezekiel were at Miriam's within an hour of the news and stayed for 3 days, and the Aldridge sons, who were capable men, took on the ranch with the support of their neighbors in the way that things were done in places where people had decided that proximity created obligation. Dusty Creek changed over the years in the small ways that towns change, buildings going up, a second general store when the original owner retired, a school that opened in 1887 in which Susan Wainwright Wilcox was involved from the first planning meeting, because education was something she had opinions about and expressed them with her characteristic directness, which the school board found either invigorating or alarming depending on the individual member. Harold James started school in 1888 and took to it with the focused attention of a child who had been read to since before he could walk and who had inherited from his mother a sense that understanding things was one of the most worthwhile activities available. Clara was more interested in the ranch work than the schoolroom, which her mother noted without judgment, having herself been more interested in the land than the abstract, and made sure she had both. Ezekiel, in the fall of 1888, 6 years after his arrival in Dusty Creek, sat down with Susan at the kitchen table and worked through the accounts for the year, as they did every fall, and the numbers told the story of what they had built with the particular clarity that good numbers have. The debt that Silas Beaumont had sent him to collect was a distant memory, paid in full and documented and filed and closed. The ranch had doubled in value since Susan had inherited it, through the drainage work and the expansion and the consistent improvement of the herd and the land. There were no outstanding debts of any kind. "What do you want?" Susan said, looking at the accounts. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "We have been building towards solvency for 6 years," she said. "We have arrived. What comes next? What do you want it to be?" He thought about it. He thought about the property next to the new southeast acreage, which he had been noticing for 2 years, and the question of whether there was a case for another expansion, not immediately but in 2 years when Harold James would be old enough to help in a substantive way. He thought about the school and whether there was a case for contributing to a second classroom. He thought about Daniel in California and the visit they had not yet made. "I want California first," he said. "I want to take the children to see their uncle before they are too old to make the journey feel like an adventure rather than a trip." Susan looked at him with the warmth that was fully her own now, fully unclosed, the expression of a woman who has been carefully loved for 6 years and has allowed that love to reach every room of herself. "That is a good want," she said. "And then," he said, "I want this, exactly this, the work and the land and the evenings and the accounts and the children and you. I want this for a very long time." She reached across the ledger and took his hand, the gesture that had been between them so many times across so many evenings in so many iterations of this same table, this same room, this same life that they had built from the unlikely material of a debt and a rooftop and a direct brown gaze that had assessed him from 10 feet up and decided, eventually, that he was the kind of man who came back when he said he would. "You have it," she said. Outside, the fall wind moved through the dry panhandle grass, and somewhere in the yard Harold James was doing something that Clara was loudly supervising. And the kitchen smelled of the coffee that was always on, and the bread that was in the oven, and the good particular smell of a house that was lived in, and taken care of, and full of the accumulated ordinary weight of people who had chosen each other, and kept choosing every day since. Ezekiel Wilcox, who had come to Dusty Creek in April of 1882 to collect on a bet, and had found instead the woman who would become his home, held his wife's hand across the table and looked at the accounts that told the story of what they were and what they had made, and found that he did not have a single word to add to what she had said, because she had said it exactly right, as she always did, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The Texas stars came up over the panhandle that night in their uncountable thousands, the same stars that had been there when he rode in 16 months before and had not known what was coming, and they shone down on 60 acres of good land and a well-built barn and a strong herd and 2 sleeping children and 2 people at a kitchen table who had arrived. Through the improbable navigation of a debt and a ladder and a ledger, and an honest conversation on a porch, and all the ordinary extraordinary days since, exactly where they were meant to be.